My name is Walter Daniel Reed. I am 68 years old, and I live in Charleston, South Carolina, a city that smells of salt water and old money, and one that knows exactly how to keep its secrets. For 36 years, I was a licensed architect. I built structures meant to outlast me: office buildings on East Bay, a waterfront hotel, and a pediatric wing at MUSC that is still standing today. 4 years ago, I sold my firm and walked away. These days, my mornings are spent in Slip 7 at the Pierce Wharf Marina, slowly restoring a 1952 wooden ketch called the Claire. She was a wreck when I found her, and the restoration is slow, but I do not mind. The way a man builds things tells you precisely how he thinks. And what happened at my own dinner table on Thanksgiving tells you everything about how my son, Nathan, and his wife, Stephanie, think. Nathan is 39, a commercial real estate lawyer who graduated from Duke University with full tuition paid by me. He is a genuinely smart kid. When he was small, he used to sit beside my drafting table and ask about load-bearing walls, wondering why certain supports couldn't simply be removed. I would explain that some supports are invisible, and you only realize they mattered once they are gone. He doesn't ask those kinds of questions anymore. Stephanie entered the picture 6 years ago. She is 36, originally from Colombia, and undeniably striking. She runs a curated interior design blog with thousands of followers, building an aesthetic life out of throw pillows and staged photographs. She married Nathan just 14 months after they met, a pace of decision-making that should have been my first warning. 3 years ago, they moved into my home at 1847 Palmetto Bluff Drive. I had designed the addition myself, drawing the plans by hand. They needed a place to stay while they got on their feet. 3 years later, they were still getting. The subtle rearrangements began within weeks. I came home one Tuesday to find my garage reorganized, my lumber pushed to the back wall to make room for her car in the center. A little chalkboard sign proudly announced, "Organized Chaos." I moved my lumber back without a word. By the following August, she was calling my living room the common area, and joking to dinner guests that living with me was like sharing a house with a very opinionated museum. Everyone laughed. Nathan laughed the loudest. I smiled, noted the temperature of that laugh, and filed it away. I don't entirely blame Nathan. He is not inherently cruel, just comfortable. Cruelty requires intention, whereas comfort just requires a couch and someone willing to make all the decisions for you. Over 6 years, I watched him shrink incrementally, much like a building settling when the ground beneath it shifts. On Thanksgiving Thursday, I was up at 5:30 a.m. to start the duck, slow roasting it in a citrus brine I had refined over 2 decades. I set the table with my mother's Beaufort silver and the good linen napkins embroidered with my monogram W.R. My neighbor, Rosalind Burns, a retired magistrate judge as sharp as a box cutter, arrived at 2. Nathan and Stephanie arrived shortly after with my 4-year-old grandson, Cody. Dinner held together structurally for the first hour. I talked about the Claire. Stephanie discussed a renovation in Mount Pleasant. Then, as I was refilling the wine glasses, Stephanie leaned toward Nathan. She used that specific register people use when they want to be heard but need deniability. "He's worthless," she whispered. "Cut him off completely." The room went completely quiet, the kind of quiet that has texture and weight. I looked at Nathan. He stared at his plate, picked up his fork, set it down, and gave one small, deliberate nod. Rosalind's eyes met mine across the table, though she didn't say a word. I picked up my napkin, folded it into a clean rectangle with the 4 corners perfectly aligned, set it beside my plate, and stood up. I politely thanked everyone for coming to my home and eating the food I prepared. Then I walked out to the back porch and closed the door. Standing in the 51-degree harbor cold without a jacket, I smiled. Not because anything was funny, but because something had just become incredibly clear. I spent that night on the Claire, lying in the small cabin below a deck, breathing in the scent of sawdust and linseed oil. I did what I always do with a complex problem. I looked for the structure. I thought about the first time I felt something was wrong, tracing the invisible shifts in the grade. In architecture, the most dangerous buildings aren't the ones that look unstable. They are the ones that look fine until they simply collapse. The next morning I drove home. The kitchen smelled like coffee. Nathan poured a cup and avoided my gaze. I waited until he was settled before looking at him with the quiet weight of an absolute fact. "Nathan, you know this house is titled in my name." It wasn't a question or a threat. It was simply pointing out a load-bearing wall before someone picked up a sledgehammer. His color barely changed, but Stephanie's hand paused over her phone for exactly 2 seconds. She knew. I retreated to my study and spent the next 36 hours observing. Stephanie made a hushed phone call from the bedroom. Nathan passed my study twice without knocking. I methodically went through my fire-rated filing cabinet until I found what I was looking for: a co-signature agreement from 3 years ago. I had added Nathan to one of my primary investment accounts during a minor medical procedure. It was a routine convenience at the time. He was listed as a co-signer, not a beneficiary. But a co-signer with access to millions of dollars, combined with a will naming him as a direct beneficiary, provided significant leverage. They had been waiting for circumstances to shift in their favor. Revenge is a reactionary emotion that makes you pull at walls without looking. Calculation makes you pull the right supports at the exact right moment. On Friday morning, I drove to the bank. The branch manager, Patterson, saw me immediately. I transferred $2 million from the joint account into a newly formed revocable trust, the W.D. Reed Family Trust, under my name alone. I left the remaining $340,000 untouched so as not to appear panicked. The entire process took 41 minutes. From the bank, I drove to the office of my attorney, Marshall Cade. Marshall is precise and communicates primarily through the arrangement of his silences. I explained the Thanksgiving incident and the bank transfer. He straightened a pen on his desk and asked what I wanted the new will to say. I stripped Nathan of his direct beneficiary status. My grandson Cody was named the primary beneficiary of the trust, set to inherit at age 25, contingent upon completing a 4-year degree and maintaining a clean criminal record. The remainder would go to Charleston Charities. Marshall ensured the language was airtight. By 3:47 p.m., the trust was registered. Over the weekend, I received 112 missed calls, 74 from Nathan, 38 from Stephanie. I did not answer. 112 calls is not the behavior of a family trying to talk. It is the behavior of people building a record of their own reasonableness while trying to prove my instability. On Monday, I met with Diana Foster, a former financial crimes detective turned private investigator. I gave her the sequence of facts and asked for a complete financial picture of Nathan and Stephanie. "Give me 72 hours, she said. That Sunday evening, an assistant from a Broad Street law firm delivered a formal letter to my door. It was drafted on behalf of Nathan, citing wrongful redistribution of jointly managed family assets. The letter implied that a 68-year-old man transferring $2 million after a family argument might be exhibiting diminished capacity. They were attempting to create legal friction, betting I would settle to avoid litigation. I waited for Diana's report. When I sat in her office 3 days later, she placed a single document face down on her desk before turning it over. It was a real estate listing agreement for my house, 1,847 Palmetto Bluff Drive. The seller of record was Nathan Allen Reed. The agency was Sullivan & Marsh. The estimated listing price was $1.78 million. The agreement had been signed 6 weeks before Thanksgiving, contingent upon my death or a change in residential occupancy. Stephanie hadn't spoken out of turn at the dinner table. She had been announcing a scheduled demolition. They had a listing agreement and a legal theory. All they needed was for me to act rashly or die. Furthermore, Diana revealed that Nathan's law firm billing had dropped by 17%, and he carried a $94,000 personal line of credit. Worse, Stephanie had an LLC, SC Home Consult Group, that had received $340,000 over 2 years. The majority of her clients were partners at Sullivan & Marsh, the same real estate firm holding the contingent listing agreement on my home. I called Marshall from my car. To shield the house from any civil claims or asset freezes resulting from Nathan's lawsuit, we immediately established a Qualified Personal Residence Trust, QPRT. I retained the exclusive right to live in the house for 7 years, after which ownership would transfer to charity. 3 weeks later, the QPRT was recorded with the county. The house was untouchable. Nathan's listing agreement was now worth nothing. When Nathan's formal lawsuit finally arrived, citing wrongful redistribution and diminished capacity, Marshall and I countered. We filed a claim for unauthorized use of real property, charging them for 38 months of unpaid fair market rent, totaling $67,200. Along with it, we served a formal 60-day notice of eviction. When the process server delivered the papers, I listened from my study as Stephanie's heels clicked frantically down the hallway toward Nathan's office. That night, I called my son. "Nathan," I said, my voice perfectly level, "I know about the Truist account. I know about SC Home Consult Group. I know about Sullivan & Marsh. Talk to Marshall Cade before the hearing if you want to limit what becomes part of the public record." He paused for 5 seconds. "Dad, I can explain." I hung up. I had given him the door. The rest was up to him. 4 days before the scheduled court hearing, Caldwell & Price sent a settlement offer. Nathan would drop the diminished capacity claim if I restored him as a 25% beneficiary, extended their residency by 12 months, and signed a joint statement framing the Thanksgiving incident as a private misunderstanding. It was a poorly disguised attempt to revert the architecture of my life back to their liking. I countered with my final terms. They vacate voluntarily by April 1st. We sign a mutual release of all claims. Nathan remains excluded from the trust, and Cody's conditional inheritance remains untouched. In exchange, I would drop my $67,200 counterclaim, provided Nathan signed a promissory note to pay me $42,000 at $700 a month over 5 years. Stephanie's lawyer rejected the counteroffer. Nathan went completely quiet. 2 days before the hearing, Nathan requested a private meeting without Stephanie. He sat across from me in Marshall's conference room, looking entirely exhausted. He confessed he hadn't known about the listing agreement or Stephanie's LLC until after Thanksgiving, framing himself as a passive passenger in his own life. "I want to accept your terms," he finally said. "All of them. I want to sign the mutual release. I want this to stop." He signed the paperwork that afternoon. The structural outcome was already decided before anyone stepped into the courtroom. The hearing before Judge Taylor lasted nearly 4 hours. Stephanie sat beside Nathan, radiating a tightly coiled, rehearsed composure. That composure shattered when Marshall introduced our fourth exhibit. The bank certification confirming Nathan's co-signer status never conferred ownership. Stephanie's hand closed into a fist and her chin lifted, the unmistakable physical reaction of someone recalculating a suddenly devastating reality. The judge's ruling was swift. Nathan's claims of wrongful redistribution and diminished capacity were entirely dismissed. My counterclaim for their eviction was sustained. They were ordered to vacate my home by the last day of March. As the courtroom cleared, Stephanie approached me in the hallway. Her voice was quiet, dripping with venom. "You'll regret this." I buttoned my coat and looked her directly in the eyes. "Stephanie, I spent 36 years building things meant to outlast me. I always know when a structure isn't viable." She held my gaze for 2 seconds before marching toward the elevator. Nathan followed her in silence. On the last Tuesday of March, a moving truck pulled up to Palmetto Bluff Drive. I stood on the front porch with a cup of coffee. Nathan carried boxes while Stephanie directed from the doorway. Little Cody walked over in his jacket, holding a stuffed bear, and hugged my leg. I crouched down and told him I would see him soon. He nodded with the solemnity of a child who feels the weight of a moment without grasping its mechanics. I watched their car pull out of the driveway and disappear down the road. What remained behind was unshakable. $2 million, safely secured in the W.D. Reed Family Trust. My home protected inside the QPRT. Cody's future $1.4 million contingent inheritance locked in place. Nathan signed promissory note for $42,000 and submitted quietly to the South Carolina Department of Revenue a voluntary disclosure regarding the financial history of SC Home Consult Group and Sullivan and Marsh. What the state chose to do with that information was their business entirely. 3 weeks later, I was back at the marina, working the final seams along the Claire's bow with a putty knife. It is the kind of work that requires absolute patience, a steady hand, and a refusal to rush what isn't ready. Rosalind wandered down the dock, carrying a foil-covered pie tin, evaluating me with her sharp judicial gaze. "Well," she said, "how are you?" I set my putty knife down and wiped my hands. "You know, Rosalind, you can't build anything that lasts on ground that hasn't been properly prepared. Sometimes you have to clear the site before you can start." She set the pie tin on the bench, seeming to find the statement entirely accurate. I poured coffee from my thermos and looked out over the water. My phone was perfectly quiet. The harbor was bright and still. The Claire smelled of fresh sawdust and marine varnish. There was nothing left unfinished that needed my attention. It was a fine morning to be 68 years old in Charleston, South Carolina.